There's an emotional connection when people talk to things and when people hear feedback or orally, verbally, if you will. And you don't want to underwhelm that. And if it feels like and that's what I mean, if it feels just transactional, that's what you're training your customers to expect from you.
Today, we're going to be talking about voice strategy. And in particular, we're going to talk a lot about custom assistants. And custom assistants is one of the biggest trends in the voice AI space. And there are many different reasons why companies are going down the route of custom AI. But one of the things you can think about is that Amazon and Google just showed everyone in the world how valuable it is to have your own assistant, to be able to control that data, control the user experience. And so many brands, big enterprises are now going down that route themselves. They're creating their own assistant, and that's enabling them to have much greater customer interaction, loyalty, all sorts of new benefits that they're bringing to the table. And so I have Jason Fields with me today from Voicify. Jason's going to walk us through what it takes to build a custom assistant, and frankly, the step before that. What's the voice strategy that leads to it? Jason Fields, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you here. I think this is a great topic. Jason, why don't we let you get right into it? And you can go ahead, share your screen. I'll jump off the stage. You can start into it. And everybody in the audience, Jason Fields from Voicify, take it away.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining today. One of the biggest questions we get, Voicify is a software company, and this isn't going to be a sales job for Voicify, but it's probably helpful for you to have perspective. As a software company, we're not terribly interested in professional services, but one of the questions that we get asked as we enter the conversation with our prospects and customers is, where do we start and how do we get there? So it became incumbent on us in a new space to take ownership over the process of how to get people to a starting point. And for that reason, among a host of others, we decided to set up a series of workshops and sessions to collaborate with prospects and customers, and also make of use to our 100 or so agency partners that are out there in the world to run this with their existing customers to figure out where the starting point is. What we're going to do today is just talk a couple of minutes about why custom assistants. Brett leaned into that a little bit. I'll lean a little bit further. And then we're going to talk about how to determine the strategy. And I'm going to use our strategy tool. It's a visual aid to talk you guys through how we go about it and how our partners go about it. And then I'll give you 3 examples of Voicify customers that have executed on the platform, having identified their own strategy. So pretty simple agenda today. I think one of the things that we get most often when we talk about custom assistants, it was easier back in the day of Alexa and Google being the only players, is what exactly is a custom assistant? And in early stages of any space, as voice probably still is, there's a lot of vernacular that's thrown around. So you hear terms like digital assistant, virtual assistant, enterprise voice assistant, et cetera. All of these things are essentially a custom assistant, just sort of skinned with a different name. So we can use those terms interchangeably within the space at this point. Now, why now? Brett said it's an emerging trend. It's where a lot of the heat is in the market. We agree. It's exactly what we're saying. And the reason being is that in early days, as Brett mentioned, Google and Alexa primarily did a really good job of training not only customers, but also businesses as to the value of conversational AI. But what we saw over time was that first, Cortana sort of backed away from allowing brands to use their platform. This happened a few years ago. And then we saw just a few weeks ago that Google Assistant is sunsetting conversational actions, which means brands that aren't associated with either media distribution or hardware management are essentially going to get the boot in June of 2023 from the Google Assistant Actions marketplace. And then, of course, we all know that Siri never really supported this in the first place, sort of standalone voice assistant interactions. Everything was tied to a native mobile app, which coincidentally is the direction Google Assistant is going. And we're happy that they've decided to call that process voicifying your native mobile application. I'm not sure that they meant us specifically, but certainly happy to hear it. That leaves Amazon Alexa and Samsung Bixby. And we all know that Samsung Bixby is a little bit low on the totem pole in terms of its usage and sort of its value to the market, which leaves Amazon Alexa. And for those of you that are curious about a perspective, I think I would say Amazon Alexa is not going to go anywhere. There still will be skills out there for people to use. So I think it's a safe platform to execute on, if only because they just don't have the technical, digital, I should say, infrastructure that Google does across a variety of different services. But the reason that these brands were so successful in getting us all on board with them was that they made something easier that was historically very complicated. The pieces of a custom assistant, ranging from wake words all the way to cross-channel distribution, are things that are very complicated to do. And this was a barrier to entry for any brand, particularly Fortune 1000 brands, because you essentially had to go out and research and procure different point solutions that answered each of these pieces of functionality. And so when you used Alexa or Google Assistant primarily, you were getting the benefit of them having done that for you. Sure, there was code that needed to be written, Lambda, et cetera, but you benefited from a lot of these things being integrated. But what happened is that over the past few years, the interest from the enterprise has leaned into devices that are not specific to where Google Assistant and Amazon Alexa are. And depending on the industry you're in, your attention and interest is going to be in different places. So we work with consumer brands that are leaning into metaverse and augmented reality, where you can put a voice assistant on a virtual object and talk to it as if it were a human. We deal with quick serve restaurants who are obviously very interested in drive-through, kiosk, and telephony. And I would say virtually every one of our customers is using as a first step native mobile applications and websites as a place to start to embed that assistant experience.
Hey, Jason, I love this conversation that you're having. And I was thinking about the previous slide. So do you believe that the exit of Google Assistant from conversational actions and their statement that they're not going to support Android apps on their voice first devices like smart speakers, smart displays, essentially ends the idea of voice as a channel?
No, and I think, when I'll use a different visual here to background this. I think that voice as a channel needs to be separated out from endpoint. And right now there's a muddying of water between Alexa and endpoints, being a mobile device, a speaker, a TV, et cetera, and Google Assistant and what their endpoints were, because there was an interstitial layer there, which was their stage, if you will, or their marketplace. With them removing that, I think voice as a channel continues to be the proper way to think about it. But this channel is interesting and perhaps a little bit different than others in that it can really play well and augment other existing digital channels in order to improve the experience for the customer or the employee.
That's interesting. So it's not like a voice first or voice only channel. There's these other channels that you're using. And I usually think of this idea of a channel versus a capability. And so we're seeing on the other end, a lot of capabilities going into mobile apps. And then we had the paradigm that Google and Amazon set up, which is a channel. And Alexa skills are still clearly a channel to consumers, because Amazon has aggregated a lot of users on the other end.
Right.
But it's the only voice first channel that's going to be left to people right now. Maybe Bixby, but they haven't had the scale that really matters. And so in any event, I'm just interested in that idea. If you're a brand and you're thinking about this, you're adding a capability, you have a channel. It sounds like there's this hybrid approach too.
Yeah, there is. And I think, I got on the voice first bandwagon when that first got started. His name's blanking on me, but we both know the guy that coined it. And I think I would change that today to and voice rather than voice first. The reason being is, just like any other digital channel or capability, there's layers to it. So can you use voice as a user interface versus having a full-blown assistant? Absolutely, for sure. And one of the examples here is a great example of that being a starting point. But the capability is scalable considerably, especially when you use a platform like ours to envelop a wider swath of subject matter and purpose.
All right, that's awesome. I'll let you keep going with your presentation, but I just wanted to ask those quick questions.
So I think the big challenge with custom assistants on a technical level, and that's not what we're here to discuss, but as a side note, is that these same capabilities are still required. whether you're going to deploy out to Facebook Messenger in the metaverse, to a kiosk, or your own hardware. I mean, we talk with operational organizations where they want to put the voice assistant in their own hardware in a warehouse environment, right? That doesn't diminish the need for all these capabilities. And this will be the only plug for Voicify I do this whole time we're together, people, so forgive me, but Voicify has all of these end to end, which is why we're being chosen, because we're reducing that technical debt or technical challenge of having to figure out how to assemble all of these things into one. By and large, where we like to start, and for context, I'm a 20-year veteran of digital agency and digital transformation work. So this was a natural step for me personally, but it's not being challenged at all by the people that I work with and work for, is really to evaluate a customer journey. And so that's a big part of the tool that I'll walk through with you folks on here in a couple of minutes. This is just a visual example from the Smithsonian Office of Visitor Services. And it's a good example because it's high level. It doesn't get into too much detail. There's certainly layers underneath this that anyone responsible for a journey or customer experience would want to get into. But the exercise that we'll talk about today is essentially about removing noise when it comes to determining how you should approach and execute with voice. So in some ways, the exercises that we go through is about removing opportunity rather than simply trying to decide from a huge swath of opportunity where to start. So let's actually dive into the tool. Toggle over. Screen should have changed for you. So we used to do these, and our partners used to do these on site back in the day. And then, of course, the world changed and we had to figure out a way to do them remotely. And as it turns out, doing it remotely is pretty much the equivalent. And we can talk more about that later if anyone's interested. We've even done these on site where we still use a digital tool like Miro, which is the one I've got here up on screen. And some basics of workshop here that I won't go into too much detail on, but we've got a back section on the left for background. So one of the important steps of this is to collect as much, if you're facilitating it, is to collect as much background on the business and marketing, customer experience, customer journeys as you can, and share that out with everybody. I like having it in the board so people can refer to it. The right section is an open sandbox just to let people doodle, take notes, practice with the tool if they're unfamiliar with it. And then obviously the meat and potatoes of this thing is right in the middle. The stuff that's pretty easy that you would do whether you were in person or remote is things like a welcome and setup, setting up ground rules, a little icebreaker I'm not going to go into with you because you could use your own. But then we get into sort of the first section that takes, I would say, typically this whole session, and I've done them with groups of 10, I've done them with groups of 70. This opening portion probably takes about 90 minutes, and this is about laying the groundwork. One of the things that we like to do in order to prepare the participants to whom voice may be a new channel and a new idea is to try to educate them as early in the planning process as possible. So even as far as a week out, you want to put together, we call it a pre-reader, a lot of information, high level stuff they can scan, look at on the subway, look at, while they're eating lunch, that sort of stuff, usually a PDF document, so that they can start onboarding a lot of information that may be second nature to those of us that are in the space. Once that happens, we get into a little bit more detail about digging into some details.
Hey, Jason, I have a quick question for you. So
yeah,
maybe this is something where the audience can go along with us here. So what question would you have maybe everyone in the audience answer if they were just thinking today about whatever their voice strategy is? Where would you start them? And maybe we could have everyone just like write it down in your notebook or type it in your little notepad, because I'd really like to see some of the creative juices start flowing for them. So what would you ask them?
Awesome. Well, we'll get back to that in a couple of minutes.
Yeah. Do you want to ask it? Let's ask them a question. I've got one. Want me to just throw it out there?
Throw it out there.
And I think we'll answer it at the end, but why doesn't everybody write down 3 objectives that you would have for your voice strategy, like what you want to get out of it? So just write those down really quickly, and then we'll come back to that and have and we'll build on that a little bit so people can get a sense of some of the things that you might go through in a workshop. All right, I'll let you keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Nature of a workshop, it's collaborative. So once you've got everybody involved and you've got them onboarded in advance a little bit with some information, you want to spend some time refreshing them on the basics of voice and conversational AI, and then really get into the workshop primer, which is where I'll spend a little bit of time. For those of you that have been in digital, and I'll zoom in a little bit here so you can see some detail. For those of you that have been in digital for some time, you probably remember when Google unveiled its concept of micromoments. And this is essentially the backbone of some of the exercises that we like to go through from a strategy standpoint. When you look at a customer journey and customer experience, whether you have it documented in your organization or not, there's going to be touch points. You send them an email, they fill out a form, they order something, it gets delivered, they have problems with it, they call customer service. These are all micro moments as it pertains to a customer journey or customer experience. And this is where you want to do your time thinking about what are some of those objections or some of those challenges in these micro moments where voice can be a plausible channel for arriving at a solution or making things easier. And I will say that in this workshop primer section is where some customization should be done. What you can download from us is a baseline. There is information that is going to be relevant and individual to the brand and to the use cases that you're going to start exploring, and you should lean into that. It doesn't need to be super high level, it should be specific. In this case, I'm going to run with the Smithsonian example. When we get into the activities portion, which is where I want to spend most of our time today, we have essentially 4 steps that we go through. One is ideation, which is exactly what it sounds like. Let's get as many ideas out on the board as we can. The second is organization. Let's organize the ideas that we just came up with. The third is prioritization. Let's prioritize the ideas that we have, hopefully not all at once. And then the last step, which is where we spend a great deal of time, is elaboration. So we take those prioritized items and we elaborate on them to try to unpack them in a way that become actionable for the organization. So in the first step here of ideation, what we want to do is give everybody, and you can see if I zoom in here real close, we've got essentially placeholders for individuals having their own stack of post-it notes. So this is exactly what we would all do if we were all in the same room with a big whiteboard. We post up the customer journey so that people can have that as a visual reference, and then we ask them to apply not only their own familiarity with the brand, but their experiences as a consumer, either of that brand or elsewhere in their lives, around what they might expect at these different touch points that have been identified, or even within the stage, even if it is not on the screen, of things that make sense for a voice assistant to be responsible for. I don't have real data in here. I threw a bunch of Post-its in here to sort of visually represent it. But on top of what Brett asked you guys as a question, I might also pose, if you were to look at your own business right now and you had to think of, call it 5 ideas, micro moments that your customers are experiencing with you. Oh, and by the way, this doesn't always apply to customers. Sometimes you may want to deal with an employee experience. The same process can be undertaken. If you had to brainstorm quickly while we're here talking, 5 ideas that would be applicable to a voice experience for your business, what would they be? Take a few minutes and jot those down, and we'll use them, I think, again, here in a couple of minutes, just in each one of the stages. This portion of the workshop can take anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes, depending on how many participants you have. Like I said, I've run this for 10, I've run it for 70. We had one customer, we did this with 5 different stakeholder groups, one at the corporate level, and then 4 other different business units, and had to aggregate it all together. So this tool scales as well. You can do this multiple times to try to get different inputs and really narrow in on where the right area of focus should be. Once you get all of these ideas documented here, this is when we take a step back. Usually we have a day break between ideation and prioritization. The reason being is that this is usually a new concept. There's a lot of information, typically a lot of involvement questions going on. We want to give everybody's brain a rest. If any of you have run workshops in the past, doing 2 4-hour days tends to get you better results than doing a single 8-hour day, right? So people get tired, give their brain a break. So we usually do a 2 to 3 hour session on day 1, take a break for a day, and then come back on, call it day 3, and do the prioritization step. What happens in between those two is something that if you're in the room with people, maybe you could do in real time. I find it as a facilitator actually more productive to do on our own. The reason being is that we're so close to the space and the capabilities that we tend to be able to do this not only more quickly, but also with a bit more authority and direction than if we were trying to do groupthink on this. And what this exercise is to simply take a look at all of the opportunities people have issued, everything from voice user interface controls for media to requesting a new credit card from my voice assistant because I lost it, and organize them into themes. And the themes are blue sky. It's not anything that's predetermined. It does take a bit of critical thinking. Another reason it's good to take a break between the 2 days because you're not rushed to do it in 30 minutes. And once you've grouped these opportunities into themes, you have hopefully fewer number of themes than you did opportunities, and it's easier to work with when we get to this next step of prioritization. Now, when we come back together as a larger group, we take these opportunities and themes. Oh, and I'll ask you, of the 5 things that you hopefully wrote down that might be applicable to your business from a conversational AI standpoint, if you had to group even those 5 things into themes, is there overlap? Are 3 of them sort of related to customer service and one is related to media controls? Is 2 of them related to loyalty and 2 of them related to website navigation, right? So the theme language is really up to you to determine. Once you get all those themes organized, when you come back, you want to take the time and explain to everybody why the themes were landed on, and certainly give people the opportunity to discuss and onboard. For those of you that have run workshops before, getting buy-in is a huge component of moving on to the next step in a workshop. If people think they're being forced to do something that they didn't have a hand in or they don't believe in, it's much less likely it's going to move forward. So it's really important that even though you did this offline, you take time the next time you're together as a group, unpack it, allow discussion, modify if you need to. My experience tells me that most groups are willing to accept what you put forward, especially if there's sound thinking behind it, which I like to think I have from time to time. So usually that's a pretty quick process. But then we get into prioritization, and this is a bit more of the fun stuff. So if we were in a room and had all of these themes and post-its on a whiteboard, we'd give everybody dots and they'd go around and assign their dots so we could count them. Digitally, we use the tool Miro. It actually has a voting function. So we give everybody, call it 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever everybody needs to do 2 exercises. The first exercise is around prioritizing the theme. So before we get into the opportunities, which could be 15, could be, I've had as many as 300, let them dig into the theme first so that they're not overwhelmed with the number of things they have to sort of cognitively process. So you let them prioritize on which theme is most important to your business. This is through the lens of, I'm sorry if it's choppy when I zoom in or out, but we really want to hit the center point of this Venn diagram, which is we're looking for a theme that can have both business value and customer value. And the third one I like to throw in is that it's marketable. The reason that marketable is important, and it applies to employees and customers alike, is that if it's marketable, you're going to have something to say about it. And this was absolutely critical back in the days when it was just Alexa and Google skills and actions that everybody was deploying, because Google and Alexa did, pardon my language, a piss poor job of marketing those skills and actions. And discoverability, I think, is one of the reasons that Google decided to drop conversational actions. It just became a behemoth of a challenge for them. Now that the assistant is going to be inside of your own digital ecosystem, it becomes easier for you to market it yourselves. But you should know how that might go, because you hopefully have a little bit of perspective on marketing capabilities of your organization. In a perfect world, you have somebody from marketing in the group who's been contributing to this, that is sort of starting to buy in on the concepts of this being a tool, not just for purpose, but also for awareness, lifetime customer value, all of those sort of, and some of the softer marketing metrics. So using those 3 tenets, you ask people to vote on which of the themes is going to be most valuable from a business, a customer, and a marketing perspective. In this example here, I've highlighted theme 5 as the sort of fake winner of our talk today. In theme 5, there were 10 options, and we're going to essentially ask them to run that exercise a second time. Typically, themes don't have more than 10 or 12 opportunities. Some of them have as few as 2 or 3. And it doesn't matter what the answer was. You simply take the opportunities from the theme that was prioritized and you ask them to do that again. This gives us our next step. And by the way, after each one of these prioritization exercises at the theme level and the opportunity level, there should absolutely be an opportunity for feedback and discussion by the group, especially if there is a domineering executive that everyone is trying to lean into their perspective for whatever political reasons may be in the organization. You want to have an opportunity to unpack it, allow people to share their feelings and thoughts about it, so you gain alignment when you move into this next one, because this next step of elaboration creates a real opportunity to move things forward. So now that you've got maybe 5 ideas written on paper and you put together the themes and maybe you were following along on your own, you can pick one of those opportunities, the one that you think makes most sense, and you can have it in the back of your mind as we talk through the elaboration process. And I've got a number of different tools in this section. Not all of them will be used. It really will depend on what you think is appropriate for your audience. But the one that I think is absolutely necessary is defining the experience, or defining the assistant rather. So we have a series of boxes sort of in grid format that have some pretty common questions that we're going to need to understand in order for an assistant to get executed and deployed. We highly recommend the assistant have a name. I think we're all used to that now with Hey Google and Alexa. If you're using software like Voicify, they should absolutely have a capability of what we call wake word. Ours does, and you get to name it. And that's important, if not only for marketing purposes, then also the usability. But some of the other things that you want to get into are going to be not only for the execution of the voice assistant, but also for the buy-in of other parts of the business. And so when you look at things like value prop and user challenges addressed, that's going to be really important for executive stakeholders to understand that there's purpose behind this. When you talk about target audience, that's probably going to affect not only executive members, but also marketing, so they understand exactly who they should be communicating to. Softer things like personality are really important, because some brands, like banks, need to be prim and proper and a little bit more formal. But if you're a consumer brand, you may have the opportunity to be a bit more playful. And being able to start defining that in early days is going to make the conversation later about exactly how to get into copywriting and conversational structures is going to make that a whole lot easier. Conversational subjects, additional challenges, and this isn't consumer challenges, this is challenges within the business. Not enough budget, not enough resources, nobody believes this will work, it can't go fast enough, whatever the challenges may be, you want to make sure that you get them documented down so you can help the team overcome them later in execution. And then you want to talk about companion channels, which is really important, because it's not just about endpoints, but it's about other channels that may be able to work in concert with the assistant in order to show the true value to the market. Brett?
Yeah, so I had a question for you about this, because I think this is a really nice framework. I'm sure you've worked with organizations that have already done some level of voice strategy, or maybe they've deployed something. And I'm guessing they nailed the personality. Well, maybe they didn't nail the personality, but they have some sense of the personality. They probably have identified some conversational subjects. What are the areas where you think they generally have the biggest gap that you wind up having to spend more time with them on because they just either ignored it or they didn't give it enough time?
I think moving beyond a transaction, at Voicify, we're not believers in voice as novelty. Those were the early days of voice, and it was fine. The web was the same way. One of the early websites was watching a fish tank through a webcam on somebody's living room. Novelty is okay. Novelty doesn't get you revenue. It doesn't get you an ROI. It doesn't get you longer customers and more satisfied customers or employees. So many of our customers will focus in on a use case that has a specific moment of transaction. That's okay. And I'll give you an example where that worked perfectly. But there's subject matter around that transaction, around that micro moment, that needs to also be considered. And it does two things. One, it creates a more robust experience for the end user, because they're not just there to do a thing, they're also there to be helped in other ways that may be softer than just transaction. The other thing it does is it starts training the business that voice, like any other channel, mobile, web, social, telephony, needs to be managed. This isn't a one and done exercise. This is a breathing, living thing. And I know to marketers, it's like, God, another thing I've got to manage. This should actually make things easier, especially using a tool like Voicify, because you're able to integrate systems that do all of the hard work for you rather than having to manually manage it. But by thinking through adjacent subjects to the micro moment that you're considering, you start leaning into the growth mode of what a voice assistant or a custom assistant should do, rather than letting it be simply a transaction agent. After we get done answering questions and documenting some parameters around all of these subject areas, this is where we want to get into a little bit of voice user experience. So if I've got any VX designers out there, this should feel sort of old hat. For those of you that haven't leaned into this level of voice assistant work, you find pretty quickly that there's typically about 4 different ways that you could design any conversation. I'll give an example of find a doctor in healthcare. The simple flow is I need to find, you ask your assistant, hey Cedars, I need to find a primary care physician. And they say, you need to go to our website. All right, well, it's an answer. It sucks, but that's an answer. Then you have the simple decision. Cedars, I need to find a primary healthcare provider. Do you prefer male or female? What area of Southern California are you in? Then you've got simple decision channel transfer, which is starting to get into finding a solution and then moving the answer into another channel. So if you're using a voice assistant that doesn't have a visual UI, finding a physician may be helpful through that manner, may be helpful for the first few steps of that process. But at some point you want to move them over to another channel via an SMS text link, via an email, whatever it may be. If you're doing this on web or mobile, that becomes very seamless. You don't have to worry about involving another channel because you're sitting within the other channel itself. Then we get into the dynamic API, what I call the dynamic API flow. And the dynamic API flow is sort of exactly what it sounds like. It's actually plugging in a system like Voicify to external data sources so that you can actually run the conversation in real time. What user number 2 says on Tuesday at 9 a.m. may get a different response than what user number 3 says Thursday at 8 a.m. because you're pulling the relevant data points out of their Find a Doctor database in real time to answer the inquiries in the conversation that they're having about you. To do that, we have included, and this is an ever-growing sort of set of iconography that we use, and conveniently, this all maps to how things are organized in Voicify. That's done on purpose for our clients, but it could be used anywhere. In order so that you don't have to worry about creating the objects for a conversational flow itself. And I'm not going to go into any detail about what all of these mean. Happy to after the fact if people are interested, but these are all the things you would need in order to sort of design any of these, very simple to, really dynamic. Once you get done with that, and this is another tool that we had put out in the world a little while ago, which is the conversational experience maturity model, is you have the opportunity to, and again, this is one of those things you may or may not do in real time, take the opportunities that were part of that theme and maybe the runner-up theme, and you start layering them into the maturity. In what order should we or could we do these things? What are the challenges behind them? Is there operational challenges? Is there technical debt? Those sorts of questions start influencing the way you lay out those opportunities into the future. Another part of Elaboration, of course, is creating a roadmap. So I've left some data in here from a previous one, but it's all anonymized. Custom voice assistants can take as quick as 2 or 3 weeks to stand up and get into a beta. For organizations that are very large and have some bureaucracy, they can take as long as 6 months. So understanding that, taking the prioritized use case and maybe even the whole theme and laying it out into the roadmap of exactly what needs to be done where is really important. And then one of the things that we find helpful as well is just defining that top prioritized idea into the brand use case. And this is meant as sort of a poster board that people could print out or send digitally to other stakeholders in the business to explain through both user flow and value proposition what the custom voice assistant in that primary use case is going to achieve. So all of the questions that we asked you guys earlier about opportunity and then theme, and you can use some of these concepts I just shared to start sketching out some of the decisions you might make against that that number one priority that you think you might have for your organization. So with that, I'll toggle back over to some examples to show you guys what some of our customers have done. So this is Volkswagen Global out of Germany. They built a custom voice assistant. They opted to deploy it in app, so in their native application, primarily in iOS, and Android is coming soon. This was a journey-driven decision by them. And what I mean by that is they wanted their assistant to be responsible for more than one micro moment. And so they did just that. Their primary use cases were around having the assistant be able to find charging stations, getting information, software information about the vehicle, and information about the charging infrastructure. These were all tied to, in this example, they used Voicify to tie into, I want to say it was 7 different proprietary internal systems in order to source the data they needed to inject into the conversation through Voicify. And they embedded it inside of the iOS app for electronic vehicle owners in Europe, and their beta group was German owners. So this was deployed out in German and English. What they ended up discovering, which we're very pleased to hear, is that the assistant actually can understand hybrid statements in German and English. I grew up in Southern California, so when I spoke Spanish to my friends, I was actually speaking Spanglish because it was half Spanish and half English. I don't know what you call that when it's half German and half English, Germanish maybe. But that was an interesting byproduct of that. What they learned in their beta with German owners, quite a bit more usage than they even anticipated in the first 30-day exercise that they had. But people were using this over and over again. So with 4,500 users over 30 days, they were getting almost 14,000 queries or inquiries or utterances spoken to the assistant and solving problems for their users. And it's all in German, so I don't know exactly what all of those breakdowns are off the top of my head, but software update obviously is one of the bigger ones from a subject matter area that they spoke to. What they learned very quickly, and this is just an interesting side takeaway, is that the assistant that they built was so powerful and so successful with their car owners in app that they actually also wanted to move it over into telephony. And so their voice assistant that they built for their electronic vehicles is essentially being modified and expanded to be the voice assistant that operates in their telephony system and helps people get to a service rep if they need to, but also solve a boatload of problems without having to put a heavy burden on a call center. The next example is Wolverine Worldwide. And if you don't know who they are, they're a global shoe company. They own brands like Keds and Sperry and Saucony and Merrell, Wolverine boots, of course, Harley Davidson boots. And they created a voice assistant that in the beginning was deployed out to general purpose assistants like Alexa and Google. And they're currently expanding it into web and mobile. This was an ROI driven decision. So they had, at the beginning of the pandemic, when all of and this is an example of sort of a single transaction, a single micro moment. At the beginning of the pandemic, when their primary retailers, Target, Walmart, Foot Locker, et cetera, were shutting their doors for health reasons, their e-commerce business blew up. And what happens after your e-commerce business blows up is typically customer support blows up too. And so they were experiencing, let's say, longer than desired wait times for people who were calling into their call centers. And we were working with them on another project, and they asked for our perspective on how their voice assistants might be able to lean into this a little bit. And so, long story short, they ended up connecting Voicify to a third-party platform for package tracking called Narvar, which is an industry leader. Brands like Nordstrom's also use them. You probably have seen the Narvar logo in some of your email confirmations and web tracking. And they allowed the data inside of Narvar to be fed into the conversational structure and machine learning of Voicify, so that when people asked where their package was to Alexa or Google and soon web and mobile assistants, they actually would get feedback and reduce the dependency on call center staff. Now, this wasn't to reduce call center staff. This was not a workforce depletion plan. This was just to allow their existing staff to use their brains in more of a critical thinking manner for more complex problems. Let the assistant take care of the mundane so that the humans can do something more meaningful. And after we arrived at this particular micro moment, as most good businesses will do, you want to take a look at ROI. So what they wanted to do was take a look at the total channel volume, which for them, for this particular single question, where's my package, consisted of phone, email, SMS, and social. The number of brands they had, which was 18. The percent of channel shift, i.e. the number or the percentage of people that could be moved from phone, email, SMS, and social into a voice assistant experience for this single question. Over 1 to 5 years, they expected a 1% channel shift, or aiming for a 1% channel shift, and then in year 1 and 20% in year 5, against engagement cost, which was about $3 per call or email, and then minus a license cost, which I won't tell you, gives them the ROI. Their ROI in the first year was about $250,000, and they're expecting in year 5 for it to be 1.9 million. So you can see that this voice assist, custom voice assistant with one question, one purpose, was a massive efficiency saver, not just operationally, but from a cost standpoint as well, giving them a boatload of reason to move forward with it, which they did. And the last example I wanted to give you is with Audacy. Audacy went through a rebranding exercise in the past 18 months. You may know them by their former name, Entercom, second largest radio station owner in North America. And they are rebuilding their digital platform. It's not a secret. They partnered with Voicify in the fall of 2021 to a point that Brett and I talked about earlier, augment those experiences that they were rebuilding for web, mobile, and beyond. I don't want to give away their strategy, but they've got a really robust set of endpoints they're thinking about for their brands. And they wanted to lean into all sorts of different subject matter. So certainly the voice user interface in the native mobile and web applications, add something to my playlist, favorite something, play, stop, go back, forward. But there's also, and this is where they accepted our strategy around being able to lean into the subject matter around the transaction. So if the transaction is a voice user interface for media controls, then the adjacent subject matter is perhaps about what you're hearing, and being able to ask questions about advertisers, about subject matter, which differs by state, by genre to genre. What you may ask an assistant while you're listening to news, what's the traffic, what's the weather, what's the stock market doing, is going to be different than when you're listening to a pop station. Who played drums on that song? When was that song recorded, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll be launching soon the first version of this, which I hope you all will go download and enjoy, because I've been working with it now for about 6 months, and it's a delightful app, including the voice assistant itself, and then expanding on that over time to make sure that things are progressing as they build on their sort of trust and training strategy.
Jason Fields, Voicify, thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you.